Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the program today is Roland Evans, and we're going to be talking about how we can garden during the winter months when it's cold and frosty and snowy, what we can do and what we shouldn't do. I'd like to welcome him to our program today, Mr. Roland Evans. And Roland, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
It's great to be with you, Daniel.
You bet. Nice and cold. I know you live in Colorado there, so I'm sure it's probably pretty difficult for people to be planting any eggplant this time of year.
Yeah, I think you have to forget that. In Colorado at the moment, where I live, we have over 2 feet of snow, blue skies, but pretty cold. And so, forget about the eggplants. And, the tomatoes are dead already, too. So, but there's lots of other parts of the countries where we're still actually, planting stuff. I was talking to somebody recently, and they were in California, Southern California, and they were just putting in a whole lot of stuff as though it was spring.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was going to ask, this time of year, okay, what should we be thinking about, and what should we be doing when it comes to the garden?
Well, we're a little late in the fall, but, for the warmer places, you can still do some fall gardening. And really you need to be thinking about next year. A lot of people at this time, including myself, kind of start to relax a little bit and kind of, move into indoors rather than stay outdoors. And don't think about the garden that much, just let it be. But actually, if you start working with just a few simple things at this time of year, you'll have amazingly good results and better results next year. Main thing I always think about at this time of year is thinking about your soil and thinking about how you want it to be and what you want it to grow next year. And one of the major things you can do as it gets colder is mulch it. And I don't know if you know about mulching. Do you, Daniel?
No, I'm not too familiar with that.
All right. Well, I was just at a friend of mine, and this is a lady who puts out a big sign outside her house saying, leaves collected. You just have to drop them in bags. And she gets as many as 200 bags of leaves a day.
Wow.
And she'll get those all the time. I actually went and collected some leaves from her, and I went and looked around her garden. She'll put layers of leaves on her garden as much as 2 to 3 feet deep.
Wow.
Exactly. I mean, I call it maxi mulch. It's mulching in an amazing way. And when she wants to start a new garden, she was showing me the new garden that she was starting. I mean, it was like a paddock. And she had layers of 2 feet of leaves all over that garden. And in the spring, she won't even need to dig that. She won't need to dig any of it. This is just straight on a paddock, straight on a grassland. But what will happen is the worms will get so active early on in the spring that they'll start to pull those leaves down into the soil. And by the time she starts planting, she says she just moves aside some of those leaves, digs a little hole, and plants whatever she wants to plant straight into the soil with the leaves all around it.
Mm-hmm.
So, what you need to be thinking about is rather than getting rid of all of your leaves and kind of leaving them beside wherever it is, the curb for the people to collect, you want to be seeing those as one of your best and richest resources for your soil. And you're wanting to get those leaves on there. One of the things she does, which is kind of an interesting thing too, is she doesn't even take some of the leaves out of the bags. She has them in these big black plastic bags, and I do the same. And if you have, say, some carrots or you have some potatoes and you want to keep them over the winter, you just throw a couple of bags of leaves on top of those and then shake the snow off them when you want to dig them up, and you'll dig underneath and you'll find it's still right in the depths of winter. It'll be still diggable down there and your vegetables will be fine.
That's amazing, because people they tend to throw those things out, and you're letting us know that this is something that becomes very useful.
Oh, it's more than useful. I mean, I'm actually been scavenging around the town because I'm high in the mountains, so I have to actually get my deciduous leaves from down in town and bring them up here because I'm up in a pine forest. But I see these as like so full of minerals. What happens with the tree is the tree's roots are deep down into the soil, and they pick up the minerals, and they put some of those minerals into the leaves, And then as they dry out, you're looking at kind of condensed minerals. And if you can then recompost those or get them back into the soil, you're adding all of those minerals back into your topsoil and making it rich and fertile.
Oh, okay. Now, what happens when your garden, let's say that the snow comes in, you haven't really prepared as you're talking about, and, here you go, you have snow all over it?
Well, that's a good thing. I think then, I would say it's you do what I do, which is you sit inside and you think. You think about your garden. You dream about your garden. Dreams of spring, I would say it is. One of the things I think is a great time to do at this time of year, if you're in the northern latitudes, if you're in colder climates, is really to think carefully and hard about greenhouses. If you want to be a gardener who produces their own food through the year, then a greenhouse is an amazing tool. And most people will think, but I'm looking at $1,000, maybe $2,000 if I want to get a greenhouse, and that's actually not true. Mm-hmm. I make my own greenhouses. I have 3 greenhouses. None of those greenhouses, they're around about 10 foot wide by 20 foot long. None of those cost me more than $350. That's complete. And they've lasted, I've had one there, I think, for 7 years now. And so you can actually just make these greenhouses, and there's plans available on my website, which is bountea.com, bountea.com, or you can actually go on the web and look at ways of building your own greenhouse using very simple materials such as conduit, electrical conduit and plastic, and just a little bit of building skills, and you can actually find yourself with something which is going to give you vegetables really throughout the year.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the winter time, things are actually going on, even though it's cold, it's frosty, it's icy, whatever the case is. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about how or what happens to, for instance, the soil in the wintertime.
Oh, well, okay. That's always an interesting question, and most of us, we're looking out, like as I might be, at the frosty ground with the snow on it, and it looks like a rock, and if you try to dig it, you can hardly get a pick into it, I can tell you. It's really hard sometimes, my soil is. And you think, okay, there must not be much going on in there. But actually, the microbes in the soil, they've adapted very well to every part of the world, really. If they're really cold, what happens is they go dormant. And what's interesting about little tiny microbes like bacteria is that they are designed to freeze. So they can actually freeze without bursting. Now, we can't freeze without bursting because our cells will actually, kind of pop, if you like, if they get frozen, because the water inside will expand and pop the cells. And it'll do that in a lot of vegetables, too. But these little critters, they can actually survive very well. And they're sitting there waiting for the temperature to reach around about 50 degrees. That's when they kind of come alive again. Mm-hmm. But there's also, in the soil, these newer microbes. They're called archaea, Archaea. They've actually only named about 200 of these things. They've only been finding them, in the last 20, 30 years. We don't know very much about them. They know that they seem to exist everywhere. They're in hot springs, they're in the Antarctic, they're in the soil, they're in the air. And these are like very, very ancient little microbes. And they're very, very hardy. See, they're sometimes called extremophiles because they'll live at extreme temperatures. They'll live sometimes without air or with air. They'll live at the bottom of the ocean in those hot vents. And these things will survive in our soil through the winter, and they'll be working away, chewing up, if you like, some of the minerals, making them available for our plants to eat or to nourish themselves in the spring. So they're very interesting, those little microbes. And the other thing, of course, that goes on in the soil is that those worms that you see, when it's nice and damp, they're protecting themselves. Interesting little critters those are, because some of them will dig down as much as 6 feet down into the ground, and they cover themselves they form a little ball, and they cover themselves with kind of mucus or slime, which doesn't freeze, and they stay down there until the temperature of the soil warms up a bit. I don't know if you can imagine that, Daniel. These little balls of slime covered little worms.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually even worms in northern climates which they will actually create like an antifreeze in their body. And they can go down to minus 15 degrees without dying.
Goodness.
I know, isn't it incredible? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the natural world is just incredible what it can manage. So you think everything's dead down there, but mostly it's just sleeping or waiting. And as soon as the temperature rises, and as I say, it likes to get up to around about 45, 50 degrees, everything just springs to life. And away you go, and you're in the spring, and everything's growing.
It's really interesting because as you're describing, a nice organic way to care for your soil so it maximizes what you tend to grow, for instance, in the spring and the summertime, is that you realize that in the wintertime there are things that you can do and then pretty much at the same time things you don't need to do. I know one of the things that's been mentioned is what you call cover crops.
Right,
exactly?
Right. Yeah, that's of the two things that are really beneficial for the soil in terms of doing something in the fall, particularly. You want to get as much mulch on there as possible, and the other thing is that you want to cover that soil. And cover crops are really you're just growing some simple, usually cereals at that time of the year. There's two main cover crops for the winter. One is winter wheat. I like winter wheat. It doesn't have such deep roots, and it's easy to get what you do, till it under in the spring. I also use barley, which is another easy one. But there's one which actually has a lot of very, very beneficial properties called winter rye. And you can often get that from a good seed merchant. You can get that online, those seeds. You can buy them in bulk for fairly cheap. And when you sow them, particularly October is a good time to do it. We're a little late now. But when you sow them, up they'll pop, particularly winter rye. Winter rye will actually suppress the seeds for any weeds around them. So they're actually very good. And they'll put down deep roots, pulling up all of those minerals into your soil. And you just forget about it. And then as soon as the spring comes, you just turn them over, maybe the first 3 or 4 inches. The roots are a little troublesome sometimes. And your soil is then ready to go. It's like it's got a whole, you've basically fed your soil using those cover crops. Really a powerful way to get your soil into condition.
Yeah, beat the heck out of pesticides and fertilizers, it sounds like.
Yeah. Most people think of organics, and actually, I had this very interesting experience not very long ago with this guy. I was talking to him about the organics, and he said, "Oh no, that's rubbish. You can't grow anything with organics. Oh, you have to put chemical fertilizers." And there was nothing I could do to persuade him. The fact that I can grow probably twice as much as anybody can grow with fertilizers using just simple organic methods. People somehow haven't quite got round to that yet, that it's actually much more productive. It's a little more labor-intensive. It's a little bit what I would call more knowledge-based. You have to actually know a little bit more than just throwing down some chemicals. But once you have the knowledge and you're willing to put in a little effort, it actually gets easier and easier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to persuade you, Daniel, to become a organic gardener. I can see you now. I can see you now. Get you out of the radio station and into the soil.
There you go. See what the plants have to say to me as I'm being interviewed. That's for sure.
Well, maybe you should interview the plants. I'm sure they would speak to you.
Absolutely. Now, I know that there was something that I have here in my notes that talks about a Harvard Yard soil restoration project. What is that exactly?
Yeah. That's a fascinating thing which I came across recently. As you know, I've talked about compost tea a lot, and I have a business doing compost tea. And actually, at the moment, I'm working on a project in the Philippines with my brother, and also in Indonesia, where we're trying to help small farmers use compost tea to get better results. But the results you can get are quite amazing, and they're just getting now really out there into the world. And there was a very interesting article in the New York Times, I think about 2 weeks ago, and it was about the Harvard Yard Soil Reclamation Project. And what they have found was that if they use compost tea, and they were using their own compost, and they weren't doing anything very, very complicated at all. You can read it. You can find it on the web quite easily. They were found that not only when they spread it all over the greens, they have these greens where I suppose the students sit around and study. I don't know. I haven't ever been there. Have you been there, Daniel?
No, I haven't.
No, I've never been to Harvard Yard. But anyway, they supposedly they pretty much worn down a lot of these greens. It was packed. The soil was packed. The grass wasn't growing well. It was just looking a little shabby. And they were spending a lot of money on fertilizers. But what they found that using compost tea, very simple just applications of this tea, and I can say a little bit more about how it was made, that the growth of the roots of their grass was more than doubled. It was like about 120% bigger than the actual roots before they used it. They used 50% less water. Because the roots are much more efficient, so they'll pick up minerals and they'll pick up nutrients and they'll pick up water much better. So they used 50% less water, no fertilizers, no pesticides. And this is a very interesting one, and I think this is something that actually people who like to grow their grass should think about, which is that because the soil was healthier, it actually, and this sounds strange, it didn't grow the grass as fast. Unhealthy soil often produces a lot of nitrogen, so it looks very green, the grass, and it grows very fast, but it's really a little weak, and so you have to mow it a lot. Do you have a lawn?
I do. I was just thinking about how my neighbor tends to mow his yard quite a bit, but I usually mow mine maybe 3 or 4 times in a whole year.
Oh, I see. So you're not out there every Saturday with your mowing machine,
Not at all.
No. Well, but when they used the compost tea, they found that it grew not only thicker, as like a nice mat, but also it grew slower. And that way they were actually able to reduce the mowing. And if you thought about that, if you think about the amount of mowing that goes on across this country in the summer months, the amount of gas that is used on those, motor mowers, and I think they pollute about 10 times as much as a normal car.
Wow.
Because they don't have any catalytic converters and things in their exhaust, they actually spew out quite a lot of nasty stuff.
Al Gore didn't even bring that up as an inconvenient truth.
That's right. Actually, I looked at some figures on that. They said if people just stopped mowing all of the grass, you'd really do a lot for global warming. But it's a great idea, isn't it? That if you you could grow your grass slower but healthier and mow it less. And that's a really powerful idea, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I could talk a little bit more about the ideas behind compost tea if you'd like me to do that.
Sure.
Yeah, yes. Well, basically compost tea is the idea of maximizing all of the benefits that you get with compost. Most of us know that compost is really beneficial. The stuff that you buy from your garden store may or may not be alive. It may or may not be that beneficial, but certainly the stuff you make yourself, even if you're just throwing your garden waste into a pile and letting it rot for a couple of years, that stuff has got a lot of microbes, bacterium, fungus, and archaea, the things I was talking about before. It also has little tiny insects and all sorts of other things in it. But it's heavy. Most people think, I don't know if I can cover the whole of my lawn with compost. That seems like an awful lot of work. So what you want to do is something similar to making yogurt. Have you ever made yogurt?
I haven't.
I can see. Yeah, you're probably not old enough to remember the 60s then. Everybody made their own yogurt when I was young. Mm-hmm. And I make my own yogurt now. And what you do is you take your milk and you maybe heat it up a little bit, and then you take just a tablespoonful of yogurt starter, or any old yogurt as long as it's alive, and you put it into your milk, and before you know it, the whole of that milk has turned into yogurt. It's like a culture. So the idea is similar with you have compost tea. where you actually take your compost and you're going to grow it like you grow the yogurt. So you put it in some water and you add some things which will feed the microbes. Those are often very simple things like molasses or bran. Some people actually, I think in the Harvard Yard project, they use flour, for instance, just ordinary wholemeal flour, because that will feed some of the microbes. And then you need to bubble air through it. It's really important that you actually aerate it, because these microbes all like air. And if you leave them without any air bubbling through it, what will happen in about 12 hours, it starts to smell nasty, that kind of stinky smell. But once you bubble air through it, what happens is they feed on the nutrients, all of these microbes, and they feed on the air. And in about, maybe 24 hours, and sometimes 48 hours, it doesn't really matter, you can do it longer, you've got millions and millions, even billions more microbes than you started with. And so you put that as a liquid onto your grass, onto your lawn, onto your vegetables, onto your trees and your shrubs, onto everything, and it brings all the soil full of life. So it's an extraordinarily good and efficient way of actually fertilizing, I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for some people it's like, oh, that sounds a little complicated. That's one of the reasons why you can buy a commercial kit. But for a lot of people who are gardeners, they like to potter around and try some of these things out. I think, within the next 5 years, and I think this is really true, in the next 5 years you're going to see a massive explosion of this kind of technology in garden stores. You're going to see people are going to start using compost tea where now they maybe haven't even heard of it because it's so efficient.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It just seems like there's so much you can do in the winter as opposed to what you think you couldn't do.
That's right. I put some compost tea in my greenhouses just this last weekend before the snow fell. And I was actually out there planting. I was planting some very interesting things which you can plant now if you've got a little warmth in your soil and you can protect your plants. I was planting a lot of Japanese greens, names which I can't even pronounce, actually. I think one was called Chin-Chang cabbage. I don't even know what it tastes like, but it's interesting and it's very hardy. And you can actually have got a greenhouse. You could be planting right now at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you'd know that you might not get very much food before January, but by January you'll be able to start eating your vegetables. I'm eating vegetables I planted in probably early September and late August. Still eating a lot of those, and I'll be expecting to actually eat some of the new vegetables in January, February.
So, and wrapping it up as far as the wintertime goes, what are some of the best plants, I guess, if you will, to be able to grow in the wintertime besides the cover crops?
The winter plants actually, it's interesting which is that they're often the healthiest plants for you to eat. Mm-hmm. I don't know if when you were young, were you told like you should eat your greens?
Absolutely.
Yeah, eat your greens. That's the most important thing to do. And actually, the greens that grow in the winter have incredibly good nutritional value. And often, because of it's cold, it will actually increase the nutritional value in the cold. So kale is really a good old standby. Nothing will beat kale. Most people think, kale, isn't that kind of rough stuff that you buy in the organic section? Well, if you grow it yourself, it's not like that at all. Sweet, tender. I even use it in salads. It's just so, when it's small, it's just got a wonderful taste. And it's not got a very harsh taste. I always look at the stuff they sell, in the produce section and think, my God, what have they done with that? It's just they let it grow for like a month too long,
Right.
And so it puts people
too many
off.
Pesticides and fertilizers, probably.
Yeah, but just letting it grow too long, not eating it small and fresh, and when it's got a delicate flavor. So kale, I would always recommend just there's a red Russian kale which will go through 0-degree temperatures. There's a white Russian kale, actually, which tastes a little sweeter. But many of the kales, there's lots of different kinds of kales. Some of the hardier cabbages and collards. I grow collards through the winter. I don't know if you're a collard fan, are you?
We use them sometimes in green drinks, absolutely.
In what?
Green drinks.
Oh,
a little bit of water, you throw it in a blender, you just grind it all up, and you drink it.
Oh, I've never heard of that. Actually, that sounds kind of, yes. No, collards. I mean, great southern crop, and does very well if you get into. My wife is a great cook, actually, and she has a blog called Awesome Eats, and she had something on there about cooking collards, where you just you put them in a pan with some onions, and you just cook them really slowly until they get very sweet. They're very nice. But collards are another great thing. If you want a very hardy one, turnip greens or beet greens. These are other greens which are really good. If you plant it a little earlier, you can do your roots like your carrots. They'll go through the winter. And so I have kohlrabi, which is a nice... Do you know kohlrabi?
No.
Kohlrabi, one I have is a purple one. It's actually in the cabbage family, and the stem kind of bulbs out until it's about the size of a baseball. And it's crispy. You can use it in salads. It's got a nice, sharp, slightly cabbagey flavor, but it's got a very nice, crispy texture, and it's great for stir-fries and things like that. What else do I grow? Well, the carrots, of course. I've talked about those. Let me think. Well, the beets, that includes the chards. Chards will go through the winter, like I call it a Swiss chard. I don't know what they call it here. I think they're just called chard. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the chard will go through the winter, so we eat those. I got my leeks growing. I have plenty of leeks and onions. Actually, keep those in the ground as well through the winter. So you can have basically most of your food. You won't get your tomatoes, as you said, and your eggplants. You're not going to get those unless you want to heat your greenhouse.
Well, it's amazing. It's just so interesting to know you can do so much in the wintertime when it comes to gardening, replenishing your soil, the types of plants that you can grow. As you were saying, your dark leafy greens, which are vital and essential, especially for really good nutrition. And, and also replenishing your soil and allowing the worms and the microbes and everybody just to have one big party underneath the sheath of snow. It's just quite amazing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that next year we're going to get you into the garden, Daniel.
Let us hope so. Anyway, it sounds like it's been such a wonderful.
That's what I'm trying to do. Get everybody out into the garden. They'll be a lot healthier.
Very good. Well, Roland Evans, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Go ahead and give out your website where people can find out more information about what to do. Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. The website is www.bountea.com, Bountea, bountea.com, and there's lots of articles and information on all sorts of topics. Very good. Well, Roland Evans, again, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Thanks again, Daniel. You betcha. Want to encourage you, get out to the garden, just like the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song, back to the garden. That's what we want to do, because when you do that, you become more sustainable as well. We also encourage you to get back to our website, which is beyond50radio.com. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter, and also visit us at our blog, where we archive our shows, as well as have great resource information for you to use, as well as to share with others. Thank you again for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.